bottle shattered. Blood ran. The old Navajo warrior smiled and stepped forward. Most people think warriors die on battlefields. They think the fight ends when the guns go silent and the dust settles. But there are men who fought wars their whole lives, not with bullets, not with bombs, but with something far more dangerous. Their bare hands, their unbroken spirit, and the kind of stubbornness that makes the earth itself step aside. This is the story of one such man. A man who bled on a barroom floor and smiled while doing it. A man the Navajo Nation still whispers about when the fire burns low and the wind carries old memories across the desert. His name was Henry Yellowhorse, and the night that bottle shattered across his face was not the night he broke. It was the night the world learned he could never be broken. Henry Yellowhorse was born in 1934 on the Navajo Reservation in northeastern Arizona, in a place so remote that the nearest paved road was 40 miles away. His mother, Ruth, delivered him inside a hogan, the traditional Navajo dwelling made of logs and earth. There was no hospital. There was no doctor. There was only Ruth, her older sister, and the quiet prayers they whispered in Dine, the Navajo language, as the baby came into the world screaming louder than any child they had ever heard. His grandmother, who was waiting outside because tradition demanded it, heard the cry and said something that would follow Henry for the rest of his life. She said the boy had the lungs of a war chief. She said he was born angry at the world and that anger would either destroy him or make him into something the people would never forget. His father, Thomas Yellowhorse, was a sheep herder. He was a quiet man with hands like leather and eyes that had seen too much sadness. Thomas had attended one of the government boarding schools as a child, a place where Navajo children were taken from their families and forced to speak English, forced to cut their hair, forced to forget who they were. Thomas never talked about those years. But sometimes, late at night, Henry would hear his father crying in his sleep, speaking in broken English mixed with Dine, begging someone unseen to let him go home. Henry did not understand it then. He was too young, but those sounds planted something deep inside the boy, a seed of rage that would grow roots so deep nothing could ever pull it out. Life on the reservation was hard in ways that people who have never lived there cannot understand. There was no running water. There was no electricity. The nearest trading post was a full day's ride on horseback. Henry's family survived on what the land gave them, which was never much. They ate mutton stew, fried bread, corn, and whatever vegetables Ruth could coax from the dry, stubborn soil. In the winter, the cold was brutal. The wind came down from the mesas like a living thing cutting through the walls of the hogan, making the fire in the center seem small and helpless. Henry and his 3 siblings would huddle together under sheep-wool blankets, pressing their small bodies against each other for warmth. Sometimes the snow would pile so high against the door that Thomas had to dig them out in the morning. Henry learned to herd sheep when he was 5 years old. He would walk for miles across the open desert following the flock, carrying a stick that was taller than he was. The sun burned his skin dark brown. The rocks cut his bare feet because shoes were a luxury his family could not afford. But Henry never complained. He watched his father work without complaint, and he decided that was how a man was supposed to be: silent, strong, enduring. The desert taught him patience. It taught him that everything worth having required suffering, and it taught him that the land did not care about your pain. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, and it was up to you to find a way to survive within it. When Henry was 7, the government men came. They arrived in a black truck that kicked up dust for a mile behind it. Henry had never seen a truck before. He stood behind his mother's legs and watched as 2 white men in suits stepped out and spoke to his father in English that Thomas barely understood. They were from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and they had come for the children. It was the law, they said. Navajo children had to attend school. They had to learn English. They had to become civilized. Ruth held Henry so tight he could feel her heartbeat against his back, fast and wild like a trapped bird. Thomas tried to argue. He tried to explain that Henry was needed for the sheep, that the family could not survive without him. But the men did not care. They had papers. They had authority. And they had the full weight of the United States government behind them. Henry was taken to a boarding school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The drive took 2 days. He sat in the back of the truck with 6 other Navajo children, none of them speaking, all of them staring at the desert passing by as if they were watching their lives disappear. When they arrived at the school, the first thing that happened was a white woman with a tight face and cold hands cut Henry's hair. In Navajo culture, hair is sacred. It is a connection to the spirit world, to the ancestors, to the earth itself. Cutting it is an act of deep disrespect, something done only in times of mourning. Henry did not cry when the scissors came. He clenched his small fists and stared straight ahead, and something in his eyes made the woman pause for just a moment before she continued. The school was a prison dressed up as a place of learning. The children slept in rows of metal beds in a cold dormitory. They were given uniforms that did not fit. They were fed food that tasted like nothing. Boiled meat and hard bread and watered-down milk. They were forbidden to speak Dine. If they were caught speaking their own language, they were beaten. Henry saw a boy named Jimmy Begay get hit across the mouth with a wooden ruler for whispering a prayer in Dine before bed. Jimmy's lips split open and blood ran down his chin, and the teacher who did it told him that savages did not pray, that God did not listen to savage languages. Henry watched this happen and felt that seed of rage inside him push its roots deeper into his bones. He survived the school the way his father survived it, by going silent, by building walls inside himself that no one could see. He learned English because he had no choice, but he never forgot Dine. He would whisper it to himself at night, under his blanket, so quietly that not even the boy in the next bed could hear. He whispered the prayers his mother had taught him. He whispered the names of the 4 sacred mountains. He whispered the stories his grandmother had told him about the hero twins, the legendary warriors who had saved the Navajo people from the monsters that once roamed the earth. Those stories kept him alive. They reminded him that he was not what the school tried to make him. He was not a savage. He was not less than. He was the descendant of warriors, and warriors endure. Henry stayed at the boarding school for 4 years. When he was 11, he ran away. He walked for 3 days across open desert, following the stars the way his father had taught him. He ate nothing. He drank water from a cattle trough he found on the 2nd day. His feet bled. His body shook with exhaustion. But he kept walking. When he finally reached the reservation, when he saw the hogan in the distance, he ran the last mile on legs that should not have been able to carry him. Ruth saw him coming and ran out to meet him, and she held him and wept. And Thomas stood in the doorway of the hogan with tears running down his face, saying nothing, because there were no words for what he felt. The government men came back, of course. They always came back. But Thomas Yellowhorse had changed during those 4 years. Something hard had formed inside him, the same hardness that was forming inside his son. Thomas met the men at the edge of his property with a rifle in his hands. He did not point it at them. He did not threaten them. He simply stood there, the rifle cradled in his arms, and told them in his broken English that his son was not going back. The men looked at Thomas. They looked at the rifle. They looked at the vast, empty desert around them, where there were no witnesses and no one to call for help, and they left. They never came back for Henry. After that, Henry grew up wild and free on the reservation. He herded sheep. He learned to break horses. He learned to hunt deer and rabbit. He grew tall and strong, with broad shoulders and hands that could crush a stone. By the time he was 16, he was already known as one of the toughest young men on the reservation. He got into fights, not because he looked for trouble, but because trouble always seemed to find him. Other boys tested him the way young men have always tested each other, with fists and words and the ancient need to prove who was strongest. Henry never lost. He fought with a cold, controlled fury that was terrifying to watch. He did not fight angry. He fought the way a thunderstorm moves across the desert with a power that was natural and unstoppable. But the reservation could not hold Henry. There was nothing there for a young man with fire in his blood. No jobs, no future. No way to become anything more than what his father was, a man broken down by poverty and sorrow, growing old before his time. Henry loved his father, but he did not want to become him. He wanted something more, though he could not have told you what that something was. All he knew was that the world beyond the reservation was vast and unknown, and he needed to see it for himself. In 1952, when Henry was 18, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. This was not unusual for Navajo men. The Navajo had a long tradition of military service, stretching back to the famous code talkers of World War II, who had used the Dine language to create an unbreakable code that helped win the war in the Pacific. Henry's uncle had been a code talker. He had come home from the war with medals on his chest and nightmares in his head, and he drank himself to death by 1948. Henry knew the risks. He knew what the military could do to a man, but he also knew that the Marines would feed him, clothe him, and give him a purpose. And more than anything, Henry Yellowhorse needed a purpose. Boot camp at Camp Pendleton in California was brutal, but Henry barely noticed. After the boarding school, after the desert, after years of breaking wild horses and fighting boys twice his size, the Marines felt almost easy. He could run farther than any other recruit. He could endure more pain. He could go longer without sleep, without food, without water. The drill instructors tried to break him the way they tried to break everyone, with screaming and humiliation and punishment. But Henry had been broken by experts when he was 7 years old, and he had put himself back together with his own hands. The Marines could not touch what was inside him. He was sent to Korea in the fall of 1952, arriving just in time for some of the war's most bitter fighting. The Korean War was a frozen nightmare. The temperatures dropped so low that weapons jammed, skin froze to metal, and men died simply from the cold. Henry fought in conditions that would have killed lesser men. He fought in the mountains near the Chosin Reservoir. He fought in trenches that filled with ice water. He fought in hand-to-hand combat when the Chinese soldiers overran their positions and the fighting became so close you could see the fear in the enemy's eyes. Henry was wounded twice in Korea. The first time, a piece of shrapnel from a mortar round tore through his left thigh. He wrapped it with a strip torn from his uniform and kept fighting. The second time, a bullet passed through his right shoulder, missing the bone by less than an inch. The medic who treated him said he should be evacuated. Henry refused. He said he had been hurt worse falling off horses back home. The medic did not believe him. But there was something in Henry's eyes that said arguing was pointless. He came home from Korea in 1954 with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a look in his eyes that his mother recognized immediately. It was the same look Thomas had brought home from the boarding school, the look of a man who had seen things that could not be unseen. Ruth held her son and whispered prayers in dying, asking the holy people to heal whatever was broken inside him. But some things cannot be healed with prayers. Some wounds go too deep for even the spirits to reach. Henry tried to go back to the reservation. He tried to live the quiet life his father lived, herding sheep and watching the sun move across the sky. But the quiet drove him crazy. In the quiet, he heard the screams of men dying in the frozen mountains of Korea. In the quiet, he heard the sound of the scissors cutting his hair when he was 7 years old. In the quiet, he heard his father crying in the night. Henry could not bear the quiet, so he left. He drifted. He moved from town to town across the Southwest, taking whatever work he could find. He worked construction in Phoenix. He worked the oil fields in Texas. He worked as a ranch hand in New Mexico, breaking horses for white men who paid him half what they paid their white workers and called him chief behind his back. Henry endured it because enduring was what he knew how to do. But the rage inside him, that seed his grandmother had seen the day he was born, was growing. It fed on every insult, every sideways look, every time someone called him a drunk Indian or told him to go back to the reservation. And when the rage got too big to hold inside, Henry drank. Alcohol hit Henry Yellowhorse like a match hits gasoline. The first time he drank, at a bar in Gallup, New Mexico, he felt something he had never felt before. Peace. The whiskey burned going down, but it silenced the screams in his head. It made the memories fade. It made the rage settle into something warm and manageable instead of the sharp, cutting thing it usually was. Henry drank, and for the first time since Korea, for the first time since the boarding school, he felt like he could breathe. But peace bought with whiskey always comes with a price. Henry became a different man when he drank. The quiet, controlled warrior disappeared, and in his place stood something dangerous. He fought in bars. He fought in parking lots. He fought anyone who looked at him wrong. And in 1950s America, a lot of people looked at a Navajo man wrong. He was arrested more times than he could count. He spent nights in jail cells across 3 states. He lost jobs. He lost friends. He lost pieces of himself that he would never get back. By 1960, Henry Yellowhorse was 26 years old and already a broken man. He was living in Gallup, a town that sits right on the edge of the Navajo reservation, a town that was famous for 2 things, turquoise jewelry and drunk Indians. Gallup was where Navajo men went to drink themselves to death. And in the early 1960s, it was not uncommon to see Navajo men passed out in alleys, on sidewalks, in doorways. The police would pick them up, throw them in the drunk tank, and release them in the morning to do it all over again. It was a cycle of destruction that had been going on for decades, and no one in power seemed to care. Henry was caught in that cycle, spinning faster and faster towards something that was either going to kill him or transform him. He did not know which. He did not care. And then came the night of the bottle. It was a Friday in late November 1960. The air was cold and dry, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. Henry was in a bar called the Silver Saddle on Route 66, a rough place that served cheap whiskey to anyone with money and did not ask questions about anything else. The bar was full of the usual crowd, ranch hands, truckers, a few Navajo men sitting in the corner where they always sat because the other patrons did not want them at the main bar. Henry was at the counter drinking alone, which was how he preferred it. He was 3 whiskeys deep, and the world was starting to soften around the edges, the way it always did when the alcohol started working. There were 4 white men at a table near the door. They were young, in their 20s, and they had been drinking since the afternoon. They were loud and mean, the kind of men who got brave when they had liquor in their blood and someone weaker to push around. Henry had noticed them when he walked in. He had seen the way they looked at the Navajo men in the corner, the sneers, the whispered jokes, the casual cruelty that passes for humor among small, frightened people. Henry had ignored them. He was not looking for trouble. He was looking for the bottom of a whiskey glass and the temporary silence it provided. But trouble does not care what you are looking for. One of the young men, a big red-faced kid with a crew cut and a denim jacket, got up from the table and walked to the bar. He stood next to Henry and ordered a beer. While he waited, he looked at Henry with the kind of expression that dogs get when they see a cat they want to chase. It was not hatred exactly. It was something worse. It was amusement. Henry was not a person to this kid. He was entertainment. The kid said something. Henry did not respond. The kid said it again, louder. He called Henry, "Chief!" He asked him where his feathers were. He asked him if he had ridden his horse to the bar. The other 3 men at the table were laughing. Henry kept his eyes on his drink. The whiskey was warm in his stomach, and the voice in his head, the one that sounded like his grandmother, was telling him to walk away. Just finish the drink and walk away. But there was another voice too, deeper and older, the voice of the rage that had lived inside him since he was 7 years old. And that voice was saying something very different. The kid put his hand on Henry's shoulder. That was the mistake. You did not touch Henry Yellowhorse without permission. It was a lesson many men had learned the hard way, and this kid was about to learn it too. Henry turned his head slowly and looked at the hand on his shoulder, then looked up at the kid's face. Whatever the kid saw in Henry's eyes made his smile falter. For just a second, the amusement was replaced by something else. Recognition, maybe. The sudden understanding that you have reached out and touched something that could kill you. But the kid was drunk, and drunk men are stupid. He did not remove his hand. Instead, he squeezed Henry's shoulder and said one more thing. He leaned in close and said it quietly, so only Henry could hear. He called Henry a dirty Indian and told him to get out of the bar because the place was for real Americans. Henry did not remember standing up. He did not remember the first punch. He remembered the sound it made, a wet crack like a branch breaking, and he remembered the kid falling backward into the table where his friends sat, sending bottles and glasses crashing to the floor. After that, everything became chaos. The 3 friends came at Henry all at once. They were young and strong and full of whiskey courage, but Henry Yellowhorse had been fighting since before they were born. He had fought boys on the reservation who were raised hard as rock. He had fought Chinese soldiers in the frozen mountains of Korea with nothing but his bare hands and a broken rifle. 4 drunk kids in a bar in Gallup were not going to be the thing that put him down. The first one swung wild. Henry stepped inside the punch the way you step through a door, smooth and natural, and drove his fist into the man's ribs. He felt something give under his knuckles, a rib cracking like a dry twig, and the man doubled over with a sound that was more surprise than pain. The second one grabbed Henry from behind, wrapping his arms around Henry's chest. Henry threw his head back and felt the satisfying crunch of cartilage as the back of his skull connected with the man's nose. The arms around his chest went slack and the man stumbled away, blood pouring between his fingers. The third one was smarter than the others. He had picked up a pool cue from the table near the wall and he swung it like a baseball bat. Henry saw it coming but could not get out of the way in time. The cue caught him across the left side of his face, just above the ear. The pain was bright and sharp, like a flash of white light behind his eyes. Henry staggered but did not fall. He had been hit harder by horses. He caught the pull cue on the backswing, ripped it out of the man's hands and broke it over his knee. Then he used the broken half to sweep the man's legs out from under him, and the man went down hard on the wooden floor. The first kid, the one with the crew cut who had started it all, had gotten back to his feet. His nose was bleeding from where he had hit the table on his way down, and the amusement was completely gone from his face now. What was there instead was fear and fury mixed together into something ugly. He grabbed a beer bottle from the bar. It was a thick brown bottle, the kind they used to make before everything went to cans and plastic, heavy as a weapon and just as dangerous. He held it by the neck and swung it at Henry's face. The bottle connected. It hit Henry on the right side of his forehead, just above his eyebrow, and it shattered. The sound it made was like nothing else in the world, a sharp, bright explosion of glass that seemed to freeze time for just a second. Pieces of broken glass went everywhere. They cut into Henry's face, his scalp, his hands. Blood came immediately, the way it always does with head wounds, fast and heavy and warm. It ran down Henry's face in thick red rivers. It filled his right eye so that he could only see out of the left. It dripped off his jaw and made dark spots on the wooden floor. The bar went silent. Everyone stopped moving. The bartender had been reaching for the phone to call the police, but his hand stopped in midair. The Navajo men in the corner were on their feet, their faces frozen somewhere between horror and something else, something that looked almost like hope. The 4 white men were scattered around the room in various states of pain and shock, and in the center of it all stood Henry Yellowhorse, blood running down his face, pieces of glass sticking out of his skin, one eye blind with blood, and he smiled. That smile was the thing people talked about for years afterward. It was not a crazy smile. It was not the smile of a man who had lost his mind. It was the smile of a man who had found something he had been looking for his whole life. It was the smile of a man who realized that the worst thing his enemies could do to him was not enough. The bottle had shattered. The blood was running. And Henry Yellowhorse was still standing. He was still breathing. He was still alive. And in that moment, standing in that dirty bar with glass in his face and blood in his eye, Henry understood something that changed the entire direction of his life. He understood that he was unbreakable. Not because he could not be hurt. He could be hurt. He was hurting right now, but because no amount of pain, no amount of hatred, no amount of cruelty could make him stop getting up. The boarding school could not break him. The alcohol and the poverty and the racism could not break him. And 4 drunk fools with a beer bottle certainly could not break him. Henry stepped forward. He did not charge. He did not rush. He stepped forward the way a mountain moves, slow and inevitable and absolutely certain. The kid with the crew cut, the one who had thrown the bottle, backed up until he hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go. Henry stopped about a foot away from him and looked into his eyes. Blood was still pouring down Henry's face. Glass was still embedded in his skin. It looked like something out of a nightmare, like something that had crawled up from the old stories, one of the monsters that the hero twins had been sent to destroy. But Henry did not hit the kid. He did not need to. The kid was shaking so hard that his teeth were clicking together. He had lost control of his bladder, and a dark stain was spreading down the front of his jeans. Henry leaned in close. He spoke in a voice that was quiet and steady, the voice of a man who has moved beyond anger into something far more powerful. He said something to that kid that no one else in the bar could hear. The kid's eyes went wide. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Henry straightened up, turned around, and walked out of the bar. He walked right through the door and into the cold November night, blood dripping from his face onto the sidewalk, leaving a trail of red drops that led across the parking lot and into the darkness. Nobody followed him. Nobody tried to stop him. And nobody in that bar ever forgot what they saw that night. The police found Henry 2 hours later. He was sitting on the curb outside a gas station about half a mile from the Silver Saddle, pressing a rag against the cut on his forehead. The blood had slowed to a steady seep. His face was a mess of cuts and drying blood, and there were still pieces of glass in his skin that he had not been able to pull out. The officers who responded were local Gallup police, and they knew Henry. Everyone in Gallup knew Henry. He was a regular in the drunk tank, a familiar face in the system, one of the many Navajo men who cycled through the courts and the jails like water through a leaking pipe. They arrested him, of course. They charged him with assault and public intoxication. They took him to the hospital first, where a doctor spent 45 minutes pulling glass out of his face and stitching up the cut on his forehead. The cut required 23 stitches. The doctor told Henry he was lucky the bottle had not hit him an inch lower, or he would have lost his right eye. Henry said nothing. He sat on the examination table and stared at the wall while the needle went in and out of his skin, and he did not flinch once. The county jail in Gallup was a place Henry knew well. The cells were small and cold, with concrete walls and a metal bunk that was more punishment than furniture. Henry lay on that bunk and stared at the ceiling and felt the stitches pulling at his skin every time he moved his face. The rage was gone. It had burned itself out in the bar, and in its place was something unfamiliar. It took Henry a while to figure out what it was. It was clarity. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his life, Henry could see himself clearly. He could see what he had become: a drunk, a brawler, a man who was slowly killing himself in bars and parking lots across the Southwest, a man who was wasting the strength that his grandmother had seen in him the day he was born. He thought about his mother. He thought about Ruth, who had held him so tight the day the government men came. He thought about the prayers she whispered over him in dying, the same prayers he whispered to himself in the boarding school dormitory. He thought about his father, Thomas, who had stood in front of those government men with a rifle in his arms and told them his son was not going back. He thought about what his parents had sacrificed to keep him alive, to keep him Navajo, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time: shame. Not the shame of losing a fight. Henry had never lost a fight. The shame of wasting a life that so many people had fought so hard to protect. Henry Yellowhorse got out of jail 3 days later. He stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse with his stitched-up face and his wrinkled clothes and the 27 cents he had in his pocket, and he made a decision. He was done drinking. He was done fighting in bars. He was done being the kind of Indian that white people expected him to be. He was going to become something else. He did not know what yet, but he knew that the man who had walked into the Silver Saddle 3 nights ago was dead. The bottle had killed him, and the man who walked out, the man who smiled with blood on his face and glass in his skin, that man was something new. Getting sober was the hardest fight of Henry Yellowhorse's life, and that is saying something for a man who had survived a government boarding school and the Korean War. The first week was agony. His hands shook so badly he could not hold a cup. His body ached, like every bone was trying to crawl out of his skin. He sweated through his clothes, even in the cold November air. He could not sleep. When he closed his eyes, the nightmares came. Not the nightmares of Korea or the boarding school, but new ones. Nightmares about whiskey. He dreamed of bottles lined up on a bar, glowing amber in the light, and in the dreams they called to him in voices that sounded like his own. "Come back," they said. "Come back and everything will be quiet again. Come back and the pain will stop." But Henry had made a decision, and Henry Yellowhorse did not go back on his decisions. He went home to the reservation. He went back to the Hogan where he was born, where Ruth was still living, older now, her hair gone grey, her hands rougher, but her eyes still carrying that fierce love that had sustained Henry through every dark chapter of his life. Thomas had died while Henry was in Korea. A heart attack, they said, though Ruth believed it was simply a broken heart that had finally stopped beating. Henry stood in the doorway of the Hogan and looked at his mother, and Ruth looked at the stitches on his face and the hollowness in his eyes. And she opened her arms and held him the same way she had held him when he was a boy, tight and warm and without a single word of judgment. Henry stayed with his mother for 6 months. During that time, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. He repaired the Hogan, which had fallen into disrepair over the years. He rebuilt the sheep pen. He chopped wood until there was enough stacked against the wall to last 2 winters. He worked from sunrise to sunset, using the physical labor to burn off the restless energy that used to drive him to the bar. When the craving for whiskey got bad, he would walk out into the desert alone and run. He would run for miles across the open land, his feet pounding the red earth, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming, until the craving passed. Sometimes he ran until he collapsed. Sometimes he lay on the ground looking up at the sky, gasping for breath, his body broken down by exhaustion, and he would laugh. He would laugh because he was still alive and the whiskey had not killed him, and the desert was still there, vast and beautiful and indifferent, exactly the way it had always been. It was during this time that Henry reconnected with the old ways. He had never completely lost his connection to Navajo culture. The prayers he whispered in the boarding school had kept that flame alive. But years of drinking and drifting had buried it under layers of pain and anger. Now, sober and home, he began to uncover it again. He attended ceremonies. He sat with the medicine men and listened to the old stories, the ones his grandmother had told him as a child. He participated in sweat lodge ceremonies, sitting in the darkness and heat, praying in dine, feeling the toxins leaving his body along with the sweat, feeling something clean and strong emerging from underneath. An old medicine man named Chester Nez, not the famous code talker of the same name but a distant relative, took an interest in Henry. Chester was in his 70s, a thin, weathered man with a face like a canyon wall, all lines and shadows and hidden depths. He saw something in Henry that others had missed, beneath the scars, beneath the rage, beneath the damage done by the boarding school and career and the years of drinking. Chester saw the warrior that Henry's grandmother had predicted. He began to teach Henry the old ways, not just the ceremonies and the prayers, but the philosophy behind them. The Navajo concept of hosho, which roughly translates to beauty, balance, and harmony. The idea that every person has a place in the world and a purpose, and that true strength comes not from fighting against the world, but from finding your place within it. Henry listened. For the first time in his adult life, he listened without the noise of anger or alcohol drowning out the words. And what he heard changed him. Chester told him that the rage he carried was not his fault, but it was his responsibility. He said that the pain of the boarding school, the pain of Korea, the pain of being Navajo in a country that had tried to erase his people, all of that pain was real and valid. But carrying it as rage was like carrying a burning coal. It only burned the hand that held it. Chester told Henry that the warrior's true battle was not against enemies. It was against the parts of himself that wanted to destroy him. The warrior's true victory was not defeating others, it was becoming whole. Henry took these teachings and made them the foundation of his new life. By the spring of 1961, he was a different man. He was still strong. He still had the build of a fighter and the eyes of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer. But the rage that had defined him for so long was changing. It was not gone. Henry would never be free of it entirely, but it was transforming. The way raw ore transforms under heat and pressure into something useful, into something with purpose. He got a job working for the Navajo Tribal Council. It was not a glamorous position. He was essentially a maintenance man, fixing fences, repairing buildings, clearing roads after storms. But it was honest work, and it paid a steady wage, and it kept Henry connected to his land and his people. He was reliable. He showed up on time. He worked harder than anyone else, and slowly, the people around him began to notice that there was something different about Henry Yellowhorse. He was not the drunk they remembered. He was not the brawler who used to get thrown in the Gallup jail every other weekend. He was something new, and they were curious about what that something was. Henry began to talk to other Navajo men who were struggling with alcohol. He did not preach. He did not lecture. He simply told them his story. He told them about the boarding school and Korea. He told them about the bars and the fights. He told them about the night the bottle shattered across his face and how he smiled because he realized that nothing could break him. And then he told them the part that mattered most. He told them that if he could stop drinking, anyone could. He told them that being Navajo was not a curse. It was a gift. He told them that their ancestors had survived worse than this, that the Navajo had endured the long walk, the forced march of 1864, when the U.S. Army drove the entire Navajo Nation 300 miles to a prison camp, and they had survived. They had come back. They had rebuilt. And if the people could survive the long walk, then any single Navajo man could survive the walk away from the bottle. These conversations started small. Henry would talk to one or two men at a time, usually over coffee at the trading post or while working alongside them on a job site. But word spread. People started seeking Henry out, asking him to talk to their sons, their brothers, their husbands. Henry never turned anyone away. He never judged. He never pretended to have all the answers. He just showed up, with his scarred face and his steady eyes and his quiet voice. And he told the truth about what alcohol does to a man and what a man can do when he puts it down. By the mid-1960s, Henry had become an informal leader in the fight against alcoholism on the Navajo reservation. He organized talking circles where men could share their struggles without shame. He drove men to the nearest treatment facility in Albuquerque, making the 4-hour trip so many times he could have driven it with his eyes closed. He took young men out into the desert and taught them the old ways, the same way Chester Nez had taught him, the sweat lodge, the prayers, the stories. He showed them that being Navajo was something to be proud of, not something to drown in whiskey. But Henry's world was about to get much bigger. In the late 1960s, a wave of change was sweeping across Native America. The Civil Rights Movement, which had been primarily associated with Black Americans, was inspiring Indigenous people across the country to demand their own rights. Organizations like the American Indian Movement were forming, and young Native Americans were no longer willing to accept the poverty, the broken treaties, and the systemic discrimination that had defined their lives for generations. Something was waking up in Indian country, and Henry Yellowhorse felt it stirring in his own blood. The first time Henry attended a political gathering, it was almost by accident. A group of young Navajo activists had organized a meeting at the chapter house in Window Rock, the capital of the Navajo Nation, to discuss water rights. The federal government had been diverting water from Navajo land to feed the growing cities of the Southwest, leaving reservation communities without enough water for their livestock, their crops, or even their own homes. Henry went because someone asked him to, and because the issue of water was personal. His mother's well had gone dry the previous summer, and she had been forced to haul water from a spring 3 miles away. Henry sat in the back of the meeting and listened. The young activists were passionate. They quoted laws and treaties. They talked about filing lawsuits and organizing protests. They had college degrees and they used big words, and they were full of the kind of righteous anger that Henry recognized because he had carried it himself for most of his life. But something was missing. The young people were angry, and their anger was justified. But anger alone had never won anything. Henry knew this from experience. Anger was fuel, but without direction. It just burned everything around it, including the person carrying it. When the meeting opened for questions, Henry stood up. He did not introduce himself because most of the people in the room already knew who he was. He was Henry Yellowhorse, the man who got hit with a bottle and smiled. The story had become something of a legend on the reservation by then, growing larger with each retelling, the way stories do. Henry looked at the young activists and he spoke in Dine first, then in English, so that everyone in the room could understand. He said that he agreed with everything they had said about the water. He said the government had been stealing from the Navajo for more than 100 years and it was time for it to stop. But then he said something that surprised everyone. He said that anger was not enough. He said that protests and lawsuits were tools, and good tools, but they would not work unless the people themselves were strong. And the people could not be strong while they were drinking themselves to death. He said that the biggest enemy of the Navajo was not the federal government, it was the bottle. He said that before they could fight for their water, they needed to fight for their sobriety. Before they could demand respect from the outside world, they needed to respect themselves. The room was quiet when Henry finished. Some of the young activists looked annoyed. They thought Henry was changing the subject, that he was distracting from the real issue. But the elders in the room, the old men and women who had seen enough of life to know wisdom when they heard it, they nodded. They understood what Henry was saying. He was not saying to give up the fight for water rights. He was saying that the fight would fail unless the fighters were whole. A nation of broken men cannot win a war, no matter how just the cause. That night changed Henry's life for the second time. He had found his purpose. Not just helping individual men stop drinking, but helping his entire people find their strength again. He became a bridge between the old ways and the new activism. He could talk to the elders in Dine, and they respected him because he knew the ceremonies and the stories. He could talk to the young people in English, and they respected him because he had the scars and the military record to prove he was no coward. Henry Yellowhorse became the man who stood in the middle and held both sides together. Over the next few years, Henry threw himself into community work with the same ferocious energy he had once put into fighting and drinking. He helped establish one of the first alcohol treatment programs on the Navajo reservation. It was not a fancy facility. It was a collection of buildings near Chinle that had been donated by a local church, repaired and refurbished by Henry and a group of volunteers. The program combined Western treatment methods with traditional Navajo healing. Patients attended group therapy sessions in the morning and sweat lodge ceremonies in the evening. They talked to counselors and they talked to medicine men. The idea was simple but revolutionary. It said that Navajo people did not have to choose between the modern world and their traditions. They could use both to heal. The program was not perfect. Funding was always a problem. The facilities were basic. Some patients relapsed, which is the nature of addiction, a disease that never fully lets go of the people it grabs. But the program saved lives. Men who had been given up for dead walked out of that place sober and clear-eyed. They went home to their families. They got jobs. They started living again. And every one of them knew that it was Henry Yellowhorse who had pulled them back from the edge. Henry also became involved in the fight for Navajo rights in ways that went beyond alcohol treatment. He traveled to Washington, D.C. 3 times in the early 1970s to testify before congressional committees about conditions on the reservation. The first time he went, he wore his Marine dress uniform with his medals pinned to his chest. He wanted those senators and congressmen to see what they were looking at, not a poor Indian begging for handouts, a United States Marine, a man who had bled for this country, a man who had earned the right to be heard. His testimony was powerful because it was simple. Henry did not use big words. He did not quote statistics or cite legal precedents. He told stories. He told them about his father crying in his sleep because of the boarding school. He told them about his mother hauling water 3 miles because the government had taken their river. He told them about the men he had seen die in the streets of Gallup, Navajo men, veterans, men who had served their country and been forgotten by it. He spoke in a voice that was calm and steady, and the room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. One senator, an older man from a western state whose name Henry never remembered, leaned forward after Henry finished speaking and asked him what the Navajo people needed. Henry looked at him for a long moment. Then he said that the Navajo people needed exactly what every other American needed: clean water, good schools, jobs, respect. He said they did not need pity. They did not need charity. They needed the government to honor the treaties it had signed and the promises it had made. He said the Navajo had kept their end of every deal. It was time for America to keep its end. That testimony made the newspapers, not the big newspapers, not the New York Times or the Washington Post, but the smaller papers across the Southwest picked it up. Henry Yellowhorse, Navajo veteran, survivor, warrior. The story about the bottle in the bar was mentioned in every article, usually near the end, as a kind of legend that proved the man's toughness. Henry did not care about the press. He cared about results, and results were slow in coming. But Henry had learned patience from the desert. He had learned that some things take time. The reservation was not going to be fixed in a year or 10 years. The damage done by a century of broken treaties and forced assimilation was deep, deeper than any single man could repair. But Henry believed in the power of small changes. One man getting sober, one family finding clean water, one child staying in school. He believed that these small changes, stacked on top of each other year after year, generation after generation, would eventually become something large enough to move the mountain. In 1975, Henry married a woman named Alice Benally. Alice was a teacher at the reservation school in Chinle, a small, fierce woman with a laugh that could fill a canyon and a stubbornness that matched Henry's own. She had grown up on the reservation, attended the University of New Mexico, and come back to teach because she believed that education was the way forward for her people.
She and Henry met at a community meeting about the school curriculum.
Henry had come to argue that Navajo language and culture should be taught alongside English and math. Alice had come to argue the same thing. They spent the entire meeting agreeing with each other in increasingly passionate terms, and by the end of it, everyone in the room could see what was happening between them. They married in a traditional Navajo ceremony at the Hogan where Henry was born. Ruth was there, old and frail but still sharp, still carrying that fierce love in her eyes. Chester Nez performed the ceremony, speaking in Dine, asking the holy people to bless this union. Henry wore turquoise and silver. Alice wore a traditional woven dress that her grandmother had made 30 years earlier. They exchanged vows in Dine and then in English, and when Henry put the turquoise bracelet on Alice's wrist, his hands were steady for the first time in years. Alice brought something into Henry's life that he had never had before: stability, peace. Not the false piece of whiskey, but the real kind, the kind that comes from knowing you are loved and that you belong somewhere. Their home was a small house near Chinle, nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a wood stove that Henry had to feed every few hours in the winter. But it was theirs. It was the first real home Henry had ever known as an adult. And when their daughter Sarah was born in 1977, Henry held her in his arms and cried. He cried because she was beautiful. He cried because she was Navajo, and he cried because he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than bone, that no one was ever going to take this child from her home. No government men in black trucks. No scissors for her hair. No cold dormitory beds. Henry would die before he let that happen. He would burn the world down before he let anyone hurt his child. The 1980s brought new challenges. The reservation was still poor. Unemployment was still devastating. Alcohol was still claiming lives. But there were changes, small ones, the kind Henry believed in. More Navajo children were graduating from high school. More were going to college. The treatment program Henry had helped establish was expanding, with new facilities opening in other parts of the reservation. And the language, the beautiful, complex Dine language that the boarding schools had tried to destroy, was being taught in schools again. Henry sat in on one of Alice's language classes once and listened to children speaking Dine, their small voices wrapping around the words that his grandmother had spoken, and he had to leave the room because the emotion was too much. But the old wounds never fully healed. Henry still carried the scars, both visible. The scar on his forehead from the bottle was a thick white line that ran from his eyebrow to his hairline, and people who met him for the first time always noticed it. The invisible scars were harder to see, but just as deep. He still had nightmares about Korea. He still sometimes woke up in the night speaking Dine, the way his father used to, caught in dreams that pulled him back to places he did not want to revisit. And the craving for alcohol, though it faded over the years, never completely disappeared. It was always there, lurking in the background, waiting for a moment of weakness. Henry fought it every day. He fought it the way he fought everything, silently, stubbornly, with the kind of endurance that the desert had taught him as a child. Alice knew about the nightmares and the cravings. She never asked Henry to explain. She never pushed him to talk about things he was not ready to talk about. She simply was there. When Henry woke up sweating and shaking, Alice would put her hand on his chest and speak to him in Dine, soft and steady, the same way Ruth used to speak to Thomas. And Henry would close his eyes and focus on her voice and let it pull him back from whatever dark place the dreams had taken him. By the early 1990s, Henry Yellowhorse was approaching 60 years old, and he had become something rare on the Navajo reservation. He had become an elder in the truest sense of the word, not just old, because plenty of people grow old without becoming wise. Henry was an elder because he had earned it. He had walked through fire and come out the other side. He had fought in a war, survived the boarding school, beaten alcohol, rebuilt his life from nothing, and spent decades helping others do the same. The young people on the reservation looked at Henry and saw something they desperately needed to see. Proof that a Navajo man could survive everything the world threw at him and still stand tall, still smile, still step forward. Henry's daughter Sarah was 14 now, a bright, serious girl with her mother's sharp mind and her father's stubborn jaw. She was doing well in school, reading books faster than Alice could bring them home, writing essays that made her teachers shake their heads in amazement. Henry watched his daughter grow and felt a pride so deep it was almost painful. Sarah was everything he had fought for. She was Navajo, and she was educated, and she was free. She spoke Dine fluently, and she spoke English fluently, and she moved between both worlds with a grace that Henry could only admire. She was what the future looked like, and the future looked good. But Henry was also watching the reservation change in ways that worried him. A new drug had arrived on Navajo land, methamphetamine. It came in from the border towns, carried by dealers who saw the reservation as an untapped market, a place full of desperate people and understaffed police departments. Meth hit the reservation like a plague. It was worse than alcohol in many ways because it destroyed people faster. A man could drink for 20 years and slowly fall apart. Meth could take a person and hollow them out in 6 months, turning them into something their own family could not recognize. Henry watched it happen. He watched young men and women he had known as children turn into ghosts. He watched families torn apart. He watched the same cycle of addiction and despair that he had lived through start all over again, only faster and more vicious. Henry responded the only way he knew how. He fought. He expanded the treatment programs to address drug addiction as well as alcohol. He went to the chapter houses and spoke to communities about the danger. He confronted dealers when he found them on reservation land, which was technically illegal because only tribal police had that authority, but Henry did not care about technicalities. He cared about his people, and when a known meth dealer was found selling to teenagers outside the high school in Chinle, Henry was the first person there. He was 58 years old and still built like a bull, with that scar on his forehead and those eyes that had made a man wet himself in a Gallup bar 30 years earlier. The dealer, a young man from Farmington who had thought the reservation was easy money, took one look at Henry Yellowhorse and decided that maybe there were better places to do business. The meth crisis on the Navajo reservation was part of a larger problem that Henry understood better than most. It was a symptom, not a cause. The cause was the same thing it had always been: poverty, hopelessness. The feeling that the world had forgotten about you and did not care whether you lived or died. Henry had felt that hopelessness himself. He knew its weight, how it pressed down on your chest like a stone and made it hard to breathe. And he knew that the only thing that could lift that stone was purpose. A man with a purpose could endure anything. A man without one would reach for the nearest bottle or needle or pipe to fill the emptiness. So Henry doubled down on his work with young people. He started a mentoring program that paired at-risk youth with elders who taught them traditional skills: sheep herding, silversmithing, weaving, horse training. The idea was not to turn back the clock. Henry was not a fool. He knew that the world was changing and that Navajo young people needed to be prepared for the modern world. But he also believed that a person who knew where they came from was less likely to lose their way. A young man who could shoe a horse and write a computer program, who could pray and dine and argue a case in English, that was a complete person. That was a person who could not be broken. The mentoring program started with 12 kids. By the end of its second year, it had over 100. Henry was there every week, driving his old pickup truck from community to community, checking on the kids, talking to the elders, making sure the program was running the way it was supposed to. Alice sometimes came with him, using the wizards as opportunities to talk to parents about the importance of education. Sarah came too, during the summers helping teach the younger kids to read and telling them stories in Dine that she had learned from her grandmother Ruth. Ruth died in 1993. She was 84 years old. She died in the Hogan where she had been born and where she had given birth to Henry, the same Hogan that Henry had repaired with his own hands when he came home from his years of drinking. Henry was with her when she passed. He held her hand and spoke to her in Dine, telling her the things he had never been able to say. He told her that she had saved his life. He told her that the prayers she taught him were the reason he was still alive. He told her that every Navajo man he had helped get sober, every kid he had mentored, every life he had touched, all of it had started with her. Ruth looked at her son with those eyes that had always seen more than they showed, and she smiled. It was a small smile, tired and peaceful, and it was the last thing she ever did. Henry buried his mother in the traditional way, on the land where she had lived her entire life, facing east toward the rising sun. He stood by her grave and cried. He was not ashamed of the tears. Chester Nez, who had died a few years earlier, had taught him that tears were not weakness. They were water, and water was the most sacred thing on Navajo land. Without water, nothing grows. Without tears, the heart dries up and dies. After Ruth's death, Henry became quieter. Not withdrawn, just quieter. The fire was still there, but it had settled into something more like embers, steady and warm rather than blazing. He continued his work with the treatment programs and the mentoring program. He continued traveling to communities across the reservation, talking to people, listening to their problems, doing what he could with the resources he had. But he also began spending more time in ceremony. He attended more sweats. He went on longer walks in the desert. He was preparing for something, though he could not have told you what it was. The Navajo do not fear death the way Western culture does. They see it as a transition, a return to the earth that gave them life. Henry was not afraid to die, but he was determined to live well until that day came. In 1998, something happened that brought Henry Yellowhorse back into the public eye in a way he had not expected. Dialed down. The United States government officially apologized for the boarding school system. There was no ceremony, no television cameras, no president standing at a podium. It was a quiet acknowledgement, buried in a larger piece of legislation about Native American education. But for the thousands of Native Americans who had survived the boarding schools, it meant something. It meant the government was finally admitting that what it had done was wrong. Henry was invited to speak at a gathering in Window Rock that was organized to mark the occasion. It was a large gathering, hundreds of people, many of them boarding school survivors, who had come from all across the Navajo Nation and beyond. Some of them were in wheelchairs. Some of them were blind. Many of them were crying before the event even started, the memories hitting them as soon as they saw others who had shared the same experience. Henry stood on a small stage made of plywood and looked out at the crowd, and for a moment he could not speak. He saw his own pain reflected in hundreds of faces. He saw the children they had been, scared and lost and stripped of everything that made them who they were. And he saw the people they had become despite all of it. Survivors, warriors, every single one of them. When Henry finally spoke, he spoke in Dine. He spoke for almost an hour. He told the story of the day the government men came for him. He told them about the truck and the scissors and the cold dormitory. He told them about Jimmy Begay getting hit for praying in his own language. He told them about running away, about walking 3 days through the desert, about his father standing in the doorway with the rifle. He told them all of this in the language that the schools had tried to destroy, and the power of hearing these stories in Dine, in the language of their mothers and fathers and grandparents, was almost too much for the crowd to bear. Then Henry switched to English. He said that the apology was good. He said it was late, but it was good. But he said that an apology was just words, and words without action were like rain that falls on rock. It runs off and nothing grows. He said the government needed to do more than apologize. It needed to fund schools on the reservation. It needed to provide clean water and decent housing. It needed to honor the treaties. He said these things in his calm, steady voice, without anger, without bitterness, just with the quiet certainty of a man who had been asking for the same things for 30 years and would keep asking for another 30 if that was what it took. The gathering ended with a traditional song. Hundreds of voices rose together in Dine, the old song filling the air above Window Rock, carrying out across the desert, carried by the wind to places no one could see. Henry stood on the stage and listened and felt something settle inside him. It was not peace exactly. It was more like completion. The circle was closing. The boy who had been taken from his home was standing in front of his people, speaking his language, and no one could stop him. No government, no boarding school, no bottle shattered across his face. The language survived, the people survived, and Henry Yellowhorse, who had survived more than most, was still standing. The early 2000s were kind to Henry, as kind as life on the reservation could be. Sarah had graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in law. She had gone to work for the Navajo Nation's legal department, fighting for the same things her father had fought for: water rights, land rights, the rights of a people who had been pushed to the margins of their own country. Alice, still teaching, still fierce, still laughing that canyon-filling laugh, told Henry that he was turning into a sentimental old man. Henry said that was fine with him. He was old now. His hair, which had been thick and black when he was young, was silver white. His face was a map of every year he had lived, lined and weathered and marked by that famous scar. His hands, which had broken horses and broken men and built buildings and held newborn babies, were stiff with arthritis. His knees ached from too many miles of running and too many years of hard labor. But his eyes were the same, dark and deep and carrying that light that people had noticed since he was a boy, the light of a man who refused to be extinguished. Henry still attended community events. He still spoke at schools and treatment centers. But more and more he was passing the work on to others. Young people he had mentored were now running programs of their own. Men he had helped get sober were now helping others. The seeds Henry had planted over 40 years were growing into something larger than he had ever imagined. There was a network of support spreading across the reservation, not an official organization, but something more organic, a web of people who had been touched by Henry Yellowhorse's story, who had been inspired by his example, who were carrying his message forward in their own ways. Henry did not take credit for any of it. He said the credit belonged to the people who did the hard work of getting sober and staying sober. He said he was just a man who had been hit with a bottle and was too stubborn to fall down. In 2008, Henry was diagnosed with lung cancer. It was not the result of smoking. Henry had never smoked. The doctors believed it was related to uranium exposure. The Navajo reservation had been the site of extensive uranium mining during the Cold War, and the mines had been abandoned without cleanup, leaving behind contaminated soil and water that poisoned the people who lived nearby. Hundreds of Navajo people had developed cancer from the uranium, and the government had been slow to acknowledge its responsibility. Henry had grown up drinking water from springs that were downstream from abandoned mines. The poison had been in his body for decades, waiting. Henry took the diagnosis the way he took everything. He nodded. He asked what his options were. And then he went home and told Alice. She did not cry. She held his hand and looked at him with those fierce eyes and told him they would fight this the same way they had fought everything else, together. The cancer was aggressive. The treatment was brutal. Chemotherapy made Henry sick in a way that nothing else ever had. He who had endured the Korean winter and the agony of alcohol withdrawal without complaint was brought to his knees by the treatment. He lost weight. He lost his silver hair. He was so weak that some days he could not get out of bed. Alice stayed by his side every minute. Sarah drove up from Window Rock every weekend, and the people came. They came from all over the reservation. Men Henry had helped get sober showed up at his door with food, with firewood, with prayers. Women who had lost husbands to alcohol before Henry intervened came with their children and grandchildren so that Henry could see what his work had meant. The stream of visitors was constant. So constant that Alice had to start turning people away so Henry could rest. Henry fought the cancer for 2 years. There were times when it seemed like he was winning. The tumors would shrink, and Henry would regain some of his strength. Enough to walk outside and sit in the sun. Enough to speak a few words in dine to the visitors who kept coming. But the cancer always came back. It was patient and relentless. And in the end, it was the one enemy that Henry Yellowhorse could not defeat. In his final months, Henry asked to be taken to the Hogan, where he was born. It was old now, the logs weathered almost black, the earth walls eroded by decades of wind and rain, but it was still standing, like Henry. He lay on a blanket on the floor and looked up at the smoke hole in the roof and saw the sky blue and infinite, the same sky he had seen as a baby when he came screaming into the world. Alice lay beside him. Sarah sat nearby, reading aloud from a book of Navajo stories. And outside, the desert stretched in every direction, vast and timeless and beautiful. Henry died on a Tuesday in March of 2010. He was 75 years old. He died in the Hogan, with Alice holding one hand and Sarah holding the other. His last words were in dine. Alice said later that he was talking to his mother, telling Ruth that he was coming home. He said it calmly, the way you would tell someone you were walking through the door after a long day of work, and then he closed his eyes. And he was gone. The funeral was the largest anyone on the reservation could remember. People came from every corner of the Navajo Nation. They came from other tribes too, Hopi and Apache and Zuni and Pueblo, people who had heard Henry's story and been moved by it. Veterans came in uniform. Former alcoholics came with their families. Teachers and lawmakers and medicine men came. The old and the young, the traditional and the modern, they all came because Henry Yellowhorse had touched their lives in ways they could never fully explain. He was buried next to Ruth, on the land where he was born, facing east toward the rising sun. The ceremony was traditional, conducted in Dine, the language that had survived everything the world had tried to do to it. Songs were sung, prayers were spoken, stories were told. And the story that was told most often, the one that people kept coming back to, was the story of the bottle. The story of the night in the silver saddle, when a young Navajo man, drunk and wounded and covered in blood, did not fall down. The story of the smile. The story of the step forward. People told it like it was a legend, and in many ways it was. But Alice, who knew the truth better than anyone, told it differently. She said the real miracle was not that Henry survived the bottle. The real miracle was what he did afterward. The real miracle was 40 years of sobriety. 40 years of service. 40 years of picking up the pieces of broken men and helping them put themselves back together. The bottle was just one night. The life that followed was the real story. Sarah Yellowhorse went on to become one of the most prominent attorneys in the Navajo Nation. She won landmark cases involving water rights and environmental cleanup. She got married and had 2 sons, and she named the oldest one Henry. Young Henry grew up hearing stories about his grandfather, the warrior who smiled when the bottle broke across his face, the man who walked through blood and fire and never once stopped moving forward. The treatment programs that Henry helped establish are still operating today. They have been expanded and modernized, but the core philosophy remains the same. The combination of Western medicine and traditional Navajo healing that Henry and Chester Nez believed in. Thousands of Navajo men and women have gone through these programs. Thousands of lives have been saved. And in every one of those programs, somewhere on a wall, or in a pamphlet, or in the words of a counselor, there is a mention of Henry Yellowhorse, the man who started it all. The mentoring program grew too. It spread beyond the Navajo reservation to other tribal communities across the Southwest. Young people who went through the program went on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists, leaders. They carried with them the lesson that Henry had taught them, that knowing where you come from makes you stronger, not weaker. That tradition and modernity are not enemies. That a warrior is not someone who fights. A warrior is someone who endures. The scar on Henry Yellowhorse's face is gone now, buried with him in the red earth of the Navajo Nation. But the mark he left on his people will last for generations. It is in the language that survived. It is in the men and women who got sober because one scarred, stubborn, unbreakable man told them they could. It is in the children who grew up proud to be Navajo because Henry Yellowhorse spent his life making sure they had something to be proud of. And on quiet nights on the reservation, when the fire burns low and the wind carries old memories across the desert, people still tell the story. They tell it in Dine and they tell it in English. They tell it to their children and their grandchildren. The story of the night the bottle shattered, the night the blood ran, the night an old Navajo warrior smiled through the pain and stepped forward into the rest of his life. Because that is what warriors do. They do not stop. They do not fall. They do not stay down. They bleed. They hurt. They carry scars that the world can see and scars that it cannot. But they keep moving. They keep stepping forward. And as long as there is one person left who remembers their name, they never truly die. Henry Yellowhorse is not dead. He is in the desert. He is in the wind. He is in every Navajo child who opens a book and reads in 2 languages. He is in every man who puts down the bottle and picks up his life. He is in the water that flows through Navajo land, finally returning to the people who were promised it long ago. He is everywhere, and he is still smiling. He is still stepping forward. He always will be.